The longer you play Gundam Battle Operation, the more likely you are to eventually run across some kind of tier list. This is, of course, a consequence of the very nature of the game. People are going to stack up all the various things they can in order to find out which ones are the strongest or not. However, what you might not realize is that, at least in GDO 2, the tier lists aren't anywhere near as comprehensive as people like to make them out. In most fighting games, for example, it is very rare that a low-tier character can contend with a high-tier character in the same game. Put any such notions completely out of mind when it comes to Gundam Battle Operation 2. For one, the different suits don't exist in a vacuum like they do in a fighting game. They exist across multiple different cost brackets, all of which are usable. Most of the time, the higher in the cost bracket you go, the less viable a lower cost suit generally is. But that's not a hard and fast rule either. There are actually a number of suits that actually become more powerful as they go up in cost. The Gelgoog Marine being a premier example of this. So by saying, for example, that a bottom tier suit in GBO 2, like say the Zaku 1, is bad, closer analysis may reveal that it's nowhere near as bad as the tier list is making it out to be. For example, yes, the Zaku 1 is absolutely atrocious at 300 points. It's slow, generally has low damage, and not too many skills on top of it. But at 200 points, which is where it's mostly used, it's perfectly viable because it's literally the only Red Zuka suit in the game at that cost. And its alternate use, as a raid machine gunner, is also completely viable at that cost. The other reason it's really not a good idea to go with the tier list being a hard and fast rule is, well, frankly, pilot preference plays a huge part of this game. There are pilots who exclusively use certain suits, and have mastered them to the point where they can do stuff that just flat out shouldn't be possible in them. I would like to regale you of a tale of the very first ranked event in GBO 2. And I've brought this particular ranked event up several times across videos in the past. It was the only one that was a best of 10 ranked match as opposed to being more conventional quick matches, and it was the only one that wasn't a brawl match. At the time, my main suit for that event was the 500-point version of the Dom Tropin, which, at the time, was considered a kinda low-tier pick. Many of the toys that particular suit has now that you take for granted, like the rocket grenades, it didn't have back then, and it was statistically a lot weaker too. I brought that particular suit into a battlefield filled with Rick Dias's and Gundam Mark IIs, and I came out on top. Top of my bracket, top 3,000 in scoring. Now you can go, oh Jameis, that's just a fluke, that doesn't mean anything. Well, the other high-ranking players in my bracket were also using suits that were in the low-tier category. The second placer, who I nearly lost to on several days, was using a Gyan. And when I say this guy was amazing, I do not begin to do his piloting style justice. As far as I was able to tell, he stacked field motor parts in order to give him a faster turn speed. He'd boost past you using maneuver armor, and then go for backstabs. The third placer was using the Gundam Blue Destiny 3, which is, at best, okay. The fourth placer was using the Hyzak Custom, which, at the time, had not received the battery of buffs that turned it into a table flipper yet. But the fifth placer was someone using the very suit we're about to discuss today. Now, that is only one event. It is only a singular data point along a much, much longer line. But would you believe me if I told you that this particular suit has seen a massive showing at literally every ranked event since? Often with players who wind up topping their particular rank bracket with. And yet at the same time, this particular suit is widely considered on most tier lists to be considered the single worst suit in the entire game. And that suit would be the Gouf Custom. And as is the case with the Zaku 1 earlier, you gotta take a look at this thing and go, okay, why is this in this spot? At cost, it's a 350 pointer. Is it bad there? It's not especially great at 550, which it scales to, but veteran players use it there all the time because it's compatible with overtune parts. So why is this considered so low by the tier list makers? Well, if I had to place it, it's because of the competition. But before I can really get into why that's the case, we really need to get into the loadout that the Gouf Custom happens to have. For cost, it's a bit tougher than the stock Gouf, though with a tiny bit less endurance. They have the same speed and thruster speed, but whereas the standard Gouf is almost entirely centered around being a close combat machine, the Gouf Custom is built more to be a supporting gunner. It has a stock 23 range boost, which is very high for a suit of this tier, and it's this that it uses to leverage its main offensive tool, the 75mm Gatling Shield. The Gatling Shield isn't especially powerful for tier, nor is it especially fast firing for tier. However, it holds 80 rounds and it has decent range. What that means is that once the Gouf Custom gets within range, the bullets just don't stop coming. The only way that you're getting this thing to stop hitting you is if either you get out of range, it has to reload, or you can get cover between you and it. With this combat style, the Gouf Custom allocates damage very, very quickly. And admittedly, there's not a hell of a lot of suits that can survive an extended damage trade with a Gouf Custom within its tier bracket. Firing so many bullets, it's really easy for the Gouf Custom to cause an accumulation stagger, even if it's only hitting another suit's shield. And those open it up for the rest of the kit. Moreover, it works along with its main secondary, namely the tri-barrel 35mm machine gun that it has mounted on its wrist. This weapon doesn't hold anywhere near as much ammo and isn't as long-ranged, and doesn't do as much damage. However, it causes accumulation stagger even faster. So it's not only a really good plinking tool, it's also a viable backup weapon, and it reloads really quickly to boot. Both of these guns feature ASL, which also means that the Gouf Custom's damage output is very, very consistent. The next weapon it has is its Heat Rod. The Gouf Custom's Heat Rod has a longer range, does significantly more damage, causes a longer-lasting radar jamming effect, and it induces heavy stagger. The downside is that, unlike the standard Gouf Heat Rod, yours isn't directional. It is solely a straightforward poke with no lateral trajectory whatsoever. It is still an unbelievably powerful tool when mastered. And finally, it has its own unique Heat Sword variant. This Heat Sword has a slightly higher base damage than the one that's used by the Gouf, but the Gouf Custom isn't quite as strong in terms of melee boost, so in practice it tends to be a little weaker in terms of raw melee damage. However, it is still very respectable in close combat. All of this combines to give the Gouf Custom a very straightforward and simple combat style. Advance forward, laying down a hail of bullets on a target, wait until they cause an accumulation stagger, get in close, fire off the Heat Rod for additional damage and a heavy stagger, then get in close with the Heat Sword for a 3-hit combo to seal the deal. At 350 points, if you successfully pull this combination off, it will absolutely lay out any support in your cost bracket. And realistically, not even generals will want to be on the receiving end of that. The Gouf Custom's combat style allows it to be very versatile with how it wants to roll. Ideally, you can head up with teammates, and that tends to be where it excels the most, but you are just as good laying down an ambush. So if it's this effective at what it does, why is it considered so low? Well, first let's get the obvious out of the way. It does not have an instant stagger option, which makes it automatically suck in the eyes of a good chunk of the player base of GBO2. However, do you remember what I said earlier about the biggest issue being the competition it has? That's specifically because of the cost bracket that it's in. It comes in at 350 points. It's also a ground-only suit, which kind of limits it a little bit, but in the tier it shows up in, you have the Ifrit Custom, the Ifrit Noct, the Blue Destiny 1, the Dom High-Speed Experimental type, and the Gelgoog G, just for starters. All of these have much more straightforward combat styles that generally have higher payoffs, but in return, they also don't have anywhere near the sustain damage. So in this regard, the Gouf Custom is kind of an oddball. The fact that it is both ground-only and ground-specialized only adds to this. Skill-wise, it's very straightforward. Melee combo controller 2, maneuver armor, anti-blast stabilizer, power accelerator. Straightforward does not equal bad. And while the Gouf Custom's role isn't exactly the flashiest of all the raids at its tier, it is a very reliable one. And I think that's kind of why it doesn't get the respect it deserves. The fact that so many tier lists can place the Gunner Gundam relatively high on this list, while shelving this thing, is basically a crime against GBO2. So where do we place this thing with a far more accurate Janus bracket? Well, at 350, it comes in at good tier. It takes some getting used to, but it is extremely powerful if you master it, and good God can it be effective in the right hands. At 400, it gets bumped down to OK tier. 400 brings in real competition that it has trouble with, the Pale Rider Dullahan being the first and most obvious. 400 also brings in the Gouf Custom's big brother, the Gouf Flight type. And it's notable because they have almost identical weapon loads. Same primary, same melee weapon, and one of the same secondaries. The only difference is that one has the Heat Rod and one has a Sturmfaust. You would think that this would make the Gouf Custom irrelevant almost immediately, but in practice, it doesn't. The Gouf Custom's 35mm fires much quicker than the one that's used by the Gouf Flight type. and as a result, it's more of a backup weapon, whereas the flight types is mostly used for plinking. The Gouf custom does significantly more damage and scales a bit harder, which is a big advantage on both counts. The Gouf flight type is obviously more mobile and is much more suited to top cover, but if you line both of them up and you're using them both for machine gunning, then the Gouf custom's going to win basically every time. With the nerfs to flight mode, the Gouf custom also has a couple of advantages all its own. Now, you do have to watch for a couple of threats at 400, most notably the Hyzak. You also need to watch for the likes of the Gundam and early production Gelgoog. 450, it is again okay tier. I actually agonized over putting this suit in this tier. I honestly was going to originally put it in poor tier, but after labbing it extensively, it wound up edging just into okay tier. The big things that are against it are, right here is where the Gundam Unit 5 is introduced. And that suit has, as one of its main weapons, a long-range Gatling gun. The thing is that it can't do that on the move. The Gouf custom still can. On the general front, you start having to worry about the likes of the Gelgoog High Mobility type, Camphor, and Alex, as well as the Gelgoog Marine Commander type. Most of these suits hit very hard in a wide variety of ranges, but several of these have either low HP, low armor, or both, and the majority of them won't want to stick around trying to fight it out with some angry Gouf custom. Because yes, the Camphor will absolutely demolish it in close combat, and yes, the Alex will easily drag it out into a drag-down fight. But in both cases, the bullets are still coming. I've played the Gouf custom enough to be on both ends of that particular conflict, and you are always going to have to pay that bullet tax whenever you encounter the Gouf custom, even if you're in a situation where you can try to roll it. And if that Gouf custom main is competent, and many of them are, that's going to be a really unpleasant thing to face down. Level 4, we are right back up to good tier. The Gouf custom gets a ridiculous number of upgrades at this tier. Both its ballistic and beam defense jump by nearly 10 points each. It also boosts its maneuver armor to level 2 and gains thruster output increase, which, against all odds, keeps its speed competitive with other suits in its bracket. Topping it all off, by this point, it gets complex expansion too. What this means is that when you fully upgrade this thing, it has 20 close range slots, 18 medium range slots, and 10 long range slots. This gives you enormous customization potential. You can specialize it to be even better at gunning things down, bulk up its defenses, increase its mobility. Anything you want to do, this thing has the custom part slots for. And because this suit's level 4 version is the 500 pointer, it also has access to overtuning parts if you have them. All of this has managed to completely turn all logic on its head. It's still using the same stupid tactic it always has, but it's still as viable as it's always been, even though you're dealing with the likes of the R-Jarja now. And with the way it works, it kind of acts as a soft counter for some of the heavy attacker suits, which is a major reason it started to be used in the events. Unfortunately, the good times don't last forever, and 550 brings us to a rather abrupt and unceremonious close. For other raids, you're contending with the Gerbera Tetra, GPO-2BB, the Bawu, the Gaplant, and to a lesser degree, even the Hyaku Shiki. Don't get me wrong, it's still playable here, it's still usable here, but the generals in this environment include the Zaku 3, Dryson, and Zekuwines Type 3. Even most of the more mundane generals that hang out at this tier like the Dizha and GPO-3 are things you don't really want to tangle with. But I'd say the true herald of the end times is honestly the Girazulu. It's fast, maneuverable, hits like a mule, it has a very powerful armament. Not only that, but it's one of the rare suits that can actually out-prioritize you in melee. With all this in mind, the Gouf custom slides into poor tier at 550. 600 plus. Please do not use the Gouf custom here. You are already bringing it into an environment where it's 50 points under cost, but bringing it in against some of the big boys to 600 is going to get you absolutely flattened. Suits like the Dovenwolf and Jesta are not things you want to be tangling with. Period. What all of this brings us to is the knowledge that the Gouf custom is actually viable for the majority of its career. It has its ups, it has its downs, it has its bad matchups, it has its good matchups. It takes care and practice to get mileage out of compared to some of the lowballers, but if you use it correctly, and you're willing to put in the time to actually understand how it works, the payoff can actually be really big. And it will always have a place in the hearts of many GBO players just because of how hard it was able to flip the table during the events. So if you're interested, consider using it, and tell them Norris Packard sent you.